Welcome back to my channel, Star Booze.
After Australian Osbourne, 76, suffered a catastrophic blow, the music industry is in shock. At one point, he said, "For me, the last 4 years have been an absolute nightmare. My health has not been in good state. This man has experienced considerably more suffering and sorrow than any the average person could live. His legs were taken away by Parkinson's illness. His spine was broken in a horrific collision, and numerous wounds are still too deep and too horrible to mention." However, Australian Osbourne, the Prince of Darkness, at the age of 76, is currently dealing with a problem that is even more excruciating than anything he has ever endured. What happened to Ozzy just now? You won't believe how much Osbourne will shake you before to the boisterous gathering, before to the burning lights. Prior to the Prince of Darkness's legend being immortalized in song past, there was nothing but quiet. A quiet so thick it felt like it would burst the spirit of a boy who never dreamed. He learned to live. John Michael Osbourne was born in 1948 in the grey slums of Aston, Birmingham. Lived in a home that was too small for two worn-out parents and 6 kids. His factory-hardened father. He saw emotion as weakness. His mother didn't have time for gentleness because she was exhausted from working on the assembly line. Austrian was the loud one, or the smart one, as he became known. The forgotten one was him. There was no safety at school. On the paper, letters crunched and danced. The numbers blended together. Dyslexia in the 1950s were mysterious. Teachers thought he was just stupid. For his peers, he was the ideal target. Bullying wasn't limited. 2 words. There were kicks, fists, alleyway, bloodied noses, and no grown-up ever inquired as to why. It was brutality without pause. Day after day, the humiliating ordeal was repeated. Things weren't at home. Kinda. He had dared to cry after suffering yet another pounding at his. Father handed him another with a belt for school. "You didn't get hurt," Ozzy would later say. "Sympathy, you were punished for it." There was no solace, no safe haven, just a screaming quiet. By 1962, the silence had grown intolerable. At the age of 14, he tied a knot in a small, poorly lighted bedroom. He got onto a chair, used his mother's clothesline to make a rope, and waited for Thethy World to let him go. However, destiny had other ideas. His dad exploded door before it was stopped. With anger, not with sympathy. The young man was beaten once more and didn't want to live. Like suffering may make you feel better. Something that day, something cracked inside him. Or perhaps it hardened at last. He gave up attempting a chill, ceased to talk until required. He wandered throughout existence with the apathetic disinterest of a person who has no higher expectations. Other kids' laughter turned into a foreign tongue. He saw a ghost with living eyes when he looked in the mirror. He left school at the age of 15 in 1963. No plan, no skills, no direction. He took any employment he could locate. Automobile manufacturing, horn tuner, construction worker, and slaughterhouse worker. However, nothing was appropriate. He was too awkward, too preoccupied, too irate, and constantly too fractured. Every job had the same conclusion. Alone, neglected, and fired. At that point, Ozzy was running out of oxygen throughout his life, not only in his lungs. Each door had closed. He wouldn't stay at any job. Adults wouldn't trust him. Hunger snagged a theme, genuine bodily hunger that caused his house to feel like a jail after his spirit was disintegrating. His clothes were barely holding together, and his shoes were worn out at the joints. The sole indication that there was hope was the reverberation of all those who had told him he was worthless. In a state of silent desperation, with no desperation, did not knock, with no food and no future. The door was kicked down. Crime resulted from desperation. A poorly executed robbery of a clothes store in 1965 when the victim was 17. Put him in the prison of Winston Green. There, amid actual criminals, he became aware of how far he had fallen. One nasty night, he was assaulted by one more prisoner. He used a metal chamber, the only weapon he knew how to defend himself. Justice wasn't served. It was a matter of survival. However, somewhere behind the anguish, the spark was still present. Then that spark was ignited one day. She and the Beatles' "I Heard Loves You" on the radio, a flash of lightning to his soul. This is the first time that he hadn't merely wished to get away from life. He desired to live it out loud and crazy, without apology. "That moment changed me," the Australian later stated. "I was unsure on how to play an instrument, but I was certain that I needed to be on the stage. I needed to yell more loudly than I am in pain." His anthem and weapon would be that scream. This wasn't Thethy, the start of his success, not quite yet. It was, however, the instant he made the decision that he would not die a forgotten youngster in Birmingham. The stage would save his life. Strangely enough, chaos would end up being his language. Of surviving. He would eventually break, bleed, burn, and lose everything. But one day, the entire world would be calling out for the youngster who had once attempted to blend into the background. Additionally, that legends are created in this way, in the ashes, not in tranquility or comfort of hopelessness, where suffering reverberates through the ages. His turbulent youth's shadows had just started to fade when an incredible event burst through the desperation-induced quiet. His spirit would be anchored for decades by a sound and a calling to follow. After being freed from Winston Green Prison in 1965, Ozzy Osbourne was only 17 and not looking for atonement. He was just floating via a world that had already determined he would not be important. His 6-week sentence, he hadn't learned any lessons from robbing a clothes store, which was more a desperate act of survival than criminal activity, merely served to affirm his social worthlessness. He left Thatchell, more broken than before but not reformed. Then a miracle occurred, not in the shape of a song rather than a savior. "She loves you," he thought when he heard the Beatles crackle through the speaker of a cheap radio. The world seemed to burst open. It felt like listening to God use music to communicate with me. Later, he recalled in an aloof, somewhat sad voice, that instant didn't take away the fear in his bones or the bruises on his back, but it gave him a vision. He knew he had to create music, but he had no idea how. Unpolished, not flawless music, but music that made a statement. By 1968, the echo of that scream had been found. He was inspired by a little newspaper ad looking for a singer to Birmingham, where he met 3 other haunted guys at a dilapidated rehearsal space. One guitarist is Tony Iommi, whose riff's rage was unabated by their missing fingertips. Butler, Geezer, a bassist whose esoteric fascination contributed to the unnerving quality of their sound. Additionally, Bill Ward was a drummer whose sound was like thunder imprisoned in a human body. They made a call initially earth, but the horror movie Black Sabbath sparked a revelation, so why not embody fear cells? As an Australian once stated, if people pay to be afraid, so why not play scary and evocative music for them? Then they had no intention of becoming celebrities. They were attempting to call up something uncooked, something that snarled at the shadows, several facets of the human condition. They weren't entertaining with their music, they were customs. On February 13, 1970, a Friday, their debut album was released under the same name. Just the date appeared to be uncommon. Critics flinched, denouncing it as a devil, disgusting, and a disrespect for music. However, in bedrooms and on the streets, alienated Black Sabbath was a wake-up call for young people who had buried their suffering. In the same year, the second album, Paranoid, was written in a matter of days and came about practically by accident. However, it turned into scripture for the injured. Songs such as Iron Man, War Pigs, and the creepy title track wasn't only a hit, they choked a generation with their war drums. On Quiet. Despite its flaws and lack of training, Ozzy's voice didn't require polish. Pain was necessary. "I was clueless about what I was doing. However, I knew it had to be loud," he said. It wasn't only volume that was loud. It was rebellion. Ozzy never acquired the ability to read music. He was untrained, but like an open wound, his voice was filled with pain. He cried out for all the boys who were told they would never be good enough. Every misfit who believed they were by themselves. He wasn't acting, he was bleeding. The myth of the lunatic still exists behind the theatrical character. The frightened child from Aston lived, the individual who attempted to terminate everything, and shouted through amplifiers to break the silence and ensure that it would never prevail again. The initial years weren't merely the beginning of heavy metal. They represented Ozzy's resurrection, emerging from ashes instead, but from willpower, blood, and dirt. A genre was not created by him clawing one into existence. Even after the world started referring to him as a legend, he still felt like a fledgling into the emptiness. But the world was altered by that cry. It constructed beyond just music. Myth was created. It created memories. It created a legacy that was rooted in suffering and, in some ways, fortitude. By the middle of the 1970s, Australian Osbourne was on the pinnacle of heavy metal success. However, beneath the boisterous throng and dazzling, his spirit was slowly disintegrating under the stage lights. The same voice that used to broke through a generation's stillness. But inner demons were now drowning it out. Spotlight could get there. The Black Sabbath had spread around the world. Pioneers over thunderous roar that addressed the broken, the outcasts, and theftless. However, for Australians, the louder the music got, the more thunderous hiss it turned into empty. He was disintegrating, behind closed doors, engulfed in a tempest of harmful behaviors, troubled by childhood scars that haven't fully healed, and the crushing weight of fame has immobilized him. Album after album, such as 1970's Paranoid and the 1973 release of Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, made the band a household name. However, Ozzy was disappearing into the darkness. Not even the stage lights could dissipate it. His bandmates started to notice the unintelligible ramblings, the skipped rehearsals behind his crazy gaze. The blaze faded. His brother in riffs, Tony Iommi, became chilly. Unspoken blame clouded the air between them and weary silence. The final betrayal occurred in 1979. They let him go, nor with dignity, nor in person. To achieve it, they dispatched another person, an Australian woodlitter, remember, his voice laden with the weight of desertion. They lacked the courage to inform me themselves. My band was that one. Not simply a career was destroyed. It was a sanctuary ripped away from him. For Australians, Black Sabbath was more than just music. It wasted one location where his brokenness turned into power and chaos made reason. He was banished without it. Cast aside like a warning sign, he vanished into a hotel room in Los Angeles, soul-sinking, curtains pulled. I simply sat in that room. You would admit afterwards, I numbed myself till my senses were gone. I believed that in that silence I would disappear. He seemed to the outer world. Ash was a dying echo of himself in that room, but nonetheless Ozzy Osbourne. A spectre has a heartbeat. Legends, however, endure. They change, and something stirred in the ashes during Ozzy's lowest moment. Sharon Arden, more than just a fallen icon, was seen by the daughter of Sabbath's former manager. She noticed Armin is not done yet. After dragging him out of the debris, she muttered the not possible. In that band, you were the magic. You don't need them to accomplish this. Her faith struck whetstone like lightning. Next up was Randy Rhoads, a youthful, diligent and talented in his own right. He didn't just play his guitar. It cried, shouted and flew. Randy was much than simply a bandmate to Ozzy. He was vital. They collaborated to create the 1980 album Blizzard of Oz, which was not created in celebration but in order to survive. Crazy Train was more than just an anthem. They were resurrected. Every chord and every lyric is a rebellion. I'm still here. It still have an impact. In retrospect, the fall was not the end. The crucible was it, the primal, resilient fire inside. Ozzy had to be shattered beyond recognition. Additionally, even if the path ahead would be paved with sorrow, loss and struggles that would leave wounds more profound than even celebrity could mend, his spirit shouted most at this point. As he put it, I was out of command, but I persisted in some way. I never stopped. The connection between Randy Rhoads and Ozzy Osbourne were more than just musicians. It had a spiritual quality. Amazing. With an almost cosmic quality. Randy did not simply enter Ozzy's life while playing a guitar. Like a light breaking through a choking storm, he appeared. Australians are still in shock over shame of being kicked out of Black Sabbath and struggling to stay sane by milli threads. Randy demonstrated that beauty, self-control, and a sense of purpose in a cruel and pointless world. Ree's youth it was concentrated. Unlike Australians, he didn't let his inventiveness run wild, but instead, it was precise and formed, flowing through glass like fire. Collectively, they were doing more than just making music. In sound, they were constructing redemption. When their Diary of a Madman, which was released in 1981, wasn't only a sequel, it was a proclamation of defiance. Once thrown away as defective merchandise, Ozzy now stands since more as a resurgent force, and that path was paved in part by Randy. Australian Randy wasn't just a guitar player. Someone said once, he was my little buddy. Sibling, and the sole reason I persisted. The bond was more profound than tunes. Ozzy's heartbeat kept her alive. During a precarious rebirth, they were electrifying on stage. Randy, controlled and magnificent. Ozzy, raw and unrestrained. Off stage, they included respect for one another, late-night conversations, philosophy, and laughing. Australian was amazed by Ree's soul as much as his talent. Ozzy, he had this grace. Remembered, as though he made every note matter, since he knew he didn't have forever. Their cooperation had an implicit sense of urgency, a mutual comprehension that lightning strikes only once. You honor it when it occurs, but storms never endure. Additionally, somewhere in the quiet before destruction, Ozzy would subsequently acknowledge feeling it, that uncanny silence before destiny decides to beck rule once more. They were flying too high, it wouldn't endure. Additionally, when it broke, it wouldn't break easily, it would break everything. In the morning of March, the nightmare Australians never saw coming was the 19th of 1982. Came with a soundless cry stuck in the throat. While traveling in, the band routinely stopped at a bus company's property near Leesburg, Florida. There, a tiny private jet remained still, a tempting toy for a restless good morning. The qualified pilot who was driving it chose to give it a fun trip. Randy, always calm and inquisitive. Rhoads boarded with cosmetics artist Rachel Youngblood. It was intended to be innocuous, a sky loop, and a little excitement before the upcoming lengthy drive. Ozzy was standing below, observing, possibly grinning a little, already plagued by an unidentified shadow. The aircraft passed twice, but on the unimaginable occurred on the third. The tour bus of the band was struck by a wing. In eighth, a plane immediately twisted, fell and burst into flames. Up in fluence, Randy Rhoads was no longer there. 25 years old. In daylight, a comet went extinguished. Screaming Ree's name till his voice broke, Ozzy sprinted toward the debris. The fire wasn't Henley fire. They were final. He fell to the side of the crash, trembling, crying because he couldn't understand what was before him. For several hours he was distraught. He was unable to speak for days, and he lived in a haze of numbness for weeks. Incredulity. He subsequently remarked, "That day, I lost a piece of myself. It wasn't only the body of Re in that fire. It was my purpose to live, my music, and my hope." The man who had been saved by a friend was now being pushed back into the dark by destiny. Additionally, this time, thy fall seemed to go on forever. He was unreachable, not even by Sharon. Initially, the shows were cancelled. The giggling ceased. The house fell silent, as though the melody has been muffled by the universe itself. Not only did Ree's passing break Ozzy, it made him hollow, and even though he would have to continue marching with time, a piece of his soul would always be in that blasting devastation on that harsh March morning. An Australian looked on in horror as Abbey for his eyes. A little plane carrying Randy burst into flames. In that, suddenly a part of Australia also perished. He disappeared into silence for weeks, unable to communicate, refusing to eat, and numbing himself by drinking alcohol to defeat. Losing Randy was like losing a piece of my soul. He subsequently remarked, I had no desire to live. I had no desire to perform music. I had nothing in mind. It wasn't only sadness. Emotional paralysis was the result. Sharon, who was previously his lifeline, strained to get to him. I believed I'd lost him forever, she acknowledged. But from the ruins of that despair, an inexplicable stirring started. Australians started writing once more, to remember, not to move on. Every word, every shout into the microphone had turned into an homage to the guy he would always remember. Ozzy understood that even though the anguish would never go away, he had to birth music. Not for himself, not only for the fans, but for Randy. He turned his survival into a show of resistance, and each subsequent show bore the burden of a tragically shaped legacy. Although he was not cured, he was, and that meant that Ozzy Osbourne was still alive. You would believe he was past his worst, that living through the unimaginable would impart healing skills to the soul. However, mourning is illogical. Additionally, for Australians, Osbourne wasn't about healing in the years following Randy Rhodes's passing. They were revealing a plunge into a personal gloom that almost engulfed him. The 1980s continued, but for Australians, they were a haze of torturous nights and numb days. Every tour was a chaotic parade. Each hotel room is a battleground of damaged battles and remorse. While the music continued to play, the man behind the microphone was coming loose. Viewers spotted a crazy dude with a bat-biting and eyeliner reputation. However, behind the scenes he was a phantom, erratic, inaccessible. Sharon made every effort. Once she had retrieved him from obscurity, but she declined to quit. However, love was insufficient to keep him grounded. As the Australian later admitted, I was spiraling, she said in a trembling voice. Even in my own life, I was absent. His drinking had gotten to the point of apocalypse in 1987, and medications made theatres of reality so profoundly that he was unable to distinguish between the real world and his nightmare. Next came the night that made all the difference, a night that was born out of complete mental breakdown. In the haze of drunkenness and emotional devastation in August 1989, there is no forgiveness for what the Aussie did. In a split second, even he could hardly imagine that he nearly killed Sharon, the woman who had already provided him a second chance, and saved him from the abyss. Later, he said, "It wasn't me," remarked in a cracked voice. "Something else seemed to have taken control. When I awoke and was informed of my actions, I desired to pass away." Ozzy had been detained that evening. He was discovered in a daze, bewildered and oblivious to the consequences of his conduct. Sharon's voice was tremulous but steady. Subsequently, revealed, "I wasn't sure if I should call a priest or file charges. I simply realized that I couldn't live like thought, and he couldn't either." Ozzy received a rehabilitation sentence for psychological stability as well as addiction. There was no public scandal. It was a private accounting. Although his kids were protected from the media, nothing could keep them from realizing that Evan, their father, had changed into a different person. Within the rehabilitation facility, Australians facetious, demons without distractions, without a stage, and without makeup. It was that he sat quietly and heard his own voice for the first time in years. Devastation he had to face, not only the suffering he had experienced, but also that he had caused suffering. He was once asked by a psychotherapist, "What do you fear most?" Ozzy, without hesitation, I replied, "That she will depart, that Sharon would eventually give upon me, but she chose not to." Sharon went to see him in treatment instead. She gave him a look, not with sympathy, but with ferocious, agonizing love that never backs down. "I noticed a broken man," she subsequently told reporters. "However, I also saw my spouse. He was still there, somewhere deep down." Ozzy's recovery was no miracle. It was war. It was a daily struggle against old ghosts and habits. However, it was his first time fighting. He battled not just to perform but also to exist, but to deserve the affection he had nearly ruined. When he came out months later, he had several scars that the tabloids couldn't see, and he was quieter and slimmer. And Evan, if there was still a long and uncertain road ahead, a fundamental shift had occurred. He understood how valuable it was to get back up after falling so far. As he would subsequently state in his documentary, "That's when I discovered he couldn't continue to die and call it life." There was quiet after the storm. Not tranquility, but a man's deafening silence attempting to recall his former self. Now Ozzy Osbourne was only wearing his most delicate form, had deteriorated to the point that even he questioned if anything remained to be rebuilt. In 1989, following an unimaginable incident in which his Sharon, the person who had protected him, was almost killed by demons, he was taken into custody and ordered into rehabilitation and mental health therapy. It was not a penalty. It was the finale. He was silent for weeks. The heavy metal frontman who used to be loud was now only a shadow in a rehabilitation facility's corner. Troubled by what had tormented by his transformation, he was almost finished. However, Sharon made a gesture that did not desert him and continues to defy reason and define unconditional love. She went, she hoped, she waited. He still had a spark inside of him. She subsequently stated, "I knew it was there, but it was buried deep." For the first time, Australianos, he started to face the monsters inside himself rather than on stage. The procedure was agonizing. It was more than simply physical detox. It ripped through his regrets, his guilt, and his memories. However, one shuddering step he left that location, not healed, but conscious. He could still battle. He gradually made a comeback to music in 1990, but not with the heedless vigor of the past, but with an unvarnished, honed intent. He and guitarist Zach got back together. Together with Wild, they started creating what would turn out to be a landmark in the career of Ozzy, No More Tears, an album from 1991. It was more than just a musical victory, it was a proclamation. Songs such as Road to Mama, I'm Coming Home, there were performances everywhere. They included love letters, confessions, and allergies, and grit and distortion-wrapped apologies. In a subsequent interview, when asked it was the sound of me trying to be human again, the Australian stated when asked what the album meant to him, the world accepted his comeback. Supporters who had thought he was permanently gone now saw him emerge as a beaten phoenix. But the battle went on behind the curtain. Each and every the performance was successful. It is a miracle every sober day. Sharon stayed at his side this time, as a participant in salvation rather than as a rescuer. Australian, once I owe her everything, she remembered. She saved my life each and every time, a single day. Their frequently strained marriage came to represent tenacity to flawed individuals battling for their lives as well as for love. During the early 1990s, Ozzy gave his all to his job. He took a tour of Theward, put out additional records, and even declared a last tour in 1992. True to pattern, he made another appearance a few years later. However, the suffering never really went away. He conveyed it through his eyes, words, voice, and the audience sensed it. I will continue as long as I am. That same disobedience, half boldness, half fervent optimism that kept Australia going. He had created a series of impossible survivals out of his life. This chapter, similar to so many before, shown that his spirit was not bound by pain. Additionally, right when the world assumed he would peacefully disappear, Ozzy would once again emerge from the ruins, demonstrating that tales live on and never die. Ozzy Osbourne believed he had survived every hardship until 2019 struck with a cruel blow that would put him to the ultimate test. Without any stage lights, on a peaceful time at home. His body betrayed him, and there was no roaring crowd. A seemingly insignificant fall turned a disastrous. The metal rods that were inserted into his spine following his stay dislodged in a TV accident in 2003, as though fate had reached back into his past and used icy, relentless hands to rip open old scars. That was unbearable, shooting through all of the bones and nerves that had formerly bore the burden of a mythology. Later, an Ozzy called it anguish. More than I've ever experienced. A powerful statement from a man who has experienced something like actual hell. However, the fall was just the start. Soon after, doctors delivered Parkinson's disease diagnosis was yet another painful blow. A persistent illness that gradually deprives the body of its freedom, control, and mobility. Fourth news wasn't simply about a man who used to dominate the stage like a force of nature. A health issue. Identity was cruelly rewritten. His hands started to shake. His legs buckled. In an interview with Good, he acknowledged, "I'm not good with secrets," said Morning America. "These days, I can't walk correctly. Days, I'm merely stumbling." This breakdown wasn't merely physical. It was the emotional burden of facing death, of seeing your once limitless vitality wane while attempting to keep the fire burning inside. The past several years have been absolute. Lassie admitted to the misery. The diagnosis and the suffering weren't the only factors. It weighs about losing parts of himself. Once more, Sharon, one symptom at a time, his anchor, supported him during each hospital stay and restless night or evening. However, despite her constant presence, the slow march of thyleness that was stealthily depleting her husband's energy. In a really poignant, Ozzy revealed his feelings of remorse for keeping the diagnosis a secret from his fans, as if his pain mailed them down in some way. Fans, however, didn't leave. They came together. The globe, recognized as the most human of all anxieties, was faced by the Prince of Darkness when one's light fades. However, his spirit remained strong despite his body's weakness. Ozzy continued to create music, and in 2020 they released Ordinary Man, an eerie and moving album. It wasn't only a document, it was an affirmation that even in situations where time, and he would always find a way to yell back when disease tried to silence him. The Ozzy's music was never the only reason to struggle. It has to do with perseverance. Each stride he took, Kane's support, and shaky legs served as a reminder that legends don't fade softly. They put up with persistent discomfort. Surgery after operation, through depressing times when he himself questioned whether he had gone back to the stage. Ozzy continued. He remarked, "I'm not ready to hang up my mic just yet," and maybe that's why his narrative is so incredibly lovely. This disobedience in face of all that was attempting to pull him down. Ozzy Osbourne was beaten but persistently reminded the world that even in the absence of light, the Ekoof, a real legend, endures forever. The shadows surrounding Ozzy Osbourne at 76 have become heavier due to the unrelenting march of stage lighting, rather than disease that has made his once unbreakable body weak. The development of Parkinson's illness has gotten worse. Every time he moves his hands, they shake. Every one step requests help. Even his famous voice, which was previously the roar that characterized the tone of heavy metal, has changed to one that is gentler and more vulnerable. The same individual who once sedanced on the brink of devastation is currently engaged in combat with a body that doesn't listen anymore. According to him, there are days where I wake up and no longer recognize myself, but I continue to fight. I haven't finished yet. Or Cisnadays, a daily routine consists of closely monitored therapy, a rigorous pharmaceutical schedule, and physical assistance. The woman who saved him from oblivion, Sharon, is still by his side, unwavering. Their residence, a Buckinghamshire rural estate, has evolved into more than just a home. It's a haven tailored to his evolving need, furnished with ramps, railings, and healthcare. Ozzy continues to try, in spite of the changes, to preserve remnants of his former way of life. He enjoys listening to music on good days. Remained moved by the same riffs that influenced him as a child. In the garden, he occasionally grabs a microphone at his home studio, but not to perform. For commemoration. Despite his deteriorating health, his mental clarity has not diminished. Flashes of the sardonic, dark humor that won him millions of fans are revealed in interviews. He frequently discusses death with an odd composure, referring to it as just without a sound check. But for the following tour, however, beneath the bluster comes a man who is acutely conscious of time. Since cancelling his tours, he has stopped performing. His last performance is in 2023, but he still delivered despite that, a last deed worthy of his memory. July 5, 2025, the world saw something remarkable. Alongside Ozzy Osbourne, for a last performance, the founding members of Black Sabbath traveled back to Birmingham, the place where it all started. Back to the Beginning is a fitting title. It was more than just a performance. It was a Over 40,000 spectators packed the arena, and over 5.8 million people watched on the internet. As Ozzy entered the stage with Sharon and Anne by her side, a respectful silence descended across the gathering. The performance that ensued was both heroic and eerie. His body shook and his voice broke, but his spirit burned every chord. It becomes a memory, every line a farewell. "This is it," he said. At one time he whispered, and everyone understood. "This could be the I'll never stand on a stage again," he whispered softly. Additionally, the concert felt as though a chapter in the history of music was being quietly closed. Every penny made an incredible $190 million was contributed to charities close to the event. To the heart of Ozzy, Birmingham Children's Hospital, Cure Parkinson's, and Acorn Hospice for Children, it was more than a simple goodbye. It was the last deed of Ozzy, demonstrated via this that despite his physical deterioration, his soul remained unbounded, giving, and defiant. Even if he no longer commands, Ozzy is still active outside of stadiums. He and Sharon keep up the Auspice podcast, which provides unvarnished insights into their lives. His admirers hear him chuckle, think, and tell tales of a life lived more loudly than most. He still engages his audience not with showmanship but via genuineness. He spends time with his grandchildren in private, as they sit by his side. He is frequently heard telling them wild stories about the crazy days. Indulgence is no longer the subject of these stories. They are about lessons learned, survival, and perseverance. The focal point of this more subdued period of Ozzy's life are his kids, who have all followed different courses influenced by their father's legacy. Amy Osbourne, his eldest daughter, was born in 1983, opted for a more quiet existence, focusing on her own music career as part of the RO project, while staying out of the family's reality show spotlight. Kelly Osbourne, born in 1984, has emerged as a distinct cultural figure, a vocalist, TV broadcaster, and fashion designer who publicly acknowledges her father's impact while creating her own identity. Next up is Jack Osbourne, who was born in 1985. A committed producer and director who frequently works with otherworldly themes, although he never backs down from the shadow of his father. Rather, he accepts it. Jack also has a significant impact on Ozzy's life now, frequently going with him to tending his doctor's appointments and assisting with his public appearances. Additionally, Ozzy has 3 older kids, Louis Osbourne, Jessica, and Thelma Riley, his first spouse, who have remained a member of his extended family network while leading a more secluded life. His relationship with each of his kids is highly visible in both public and private life, particularly Kelly and Jack. They have not only retained some of his charm and inventiveness, but now serve as protectors of his legacy, making sure the Osbourne name is respected going forward as well as resonance. Ozzy is much more than simply a rock star these days. He is a cultural A-man whose life reads like a myth, an icon, a survivor. From a boy who was bullied in Birmingham to the heavy metal creator. From the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame to the rehabilitation, beds, stage dives, Tower Hill chair ramps. His path is one of growth by suffering. His wealth, still projected to reach more than $220 million by 2025, may seem astounding, but it's no longer seen as an indulgence among Australians, or notoriety. It's a tool, a means of giving back, and a method to express gratitude to the world that once hated him, doubted him, and loved him despite everything him. He reportedly completed his will in early 2024, not out or panic but without intention. I've avoided death too many times to be careless,